Well, this might seem totally random, but this has just popped up into my head. I remember we had, I was in secondary school in Barnsley, and our geography teacher was asking us all about what our parents do. Now, I hate this question, but I was really proud of myself because I'd had a chat with my dad about what he did and what he did back then as a steel worker, and asked him about the kind of things that he'd been doing. And as a welder, obviously he works a lot with different makes different things. But one of the things that he'd recently done was he'd welded together the goalposts being used at Bramley Lane for Sheffield United. And I'm not even remotely a Sheffield United fan. I mean, I'm a Barnsley fan. At least they wear red. That's nice. But I'm not exactly a massive fan of them. They're all right. But the fact that he'd actually put those goalposts together that were being used by these top footballers at the time, or sort of top at Sheffield United, was a massive sort of surprise. And I remember saying that, beaming in the classroom, saying, "Oh yeah, my dad, welded the goalposts at Sheffield United at Bramley Lane," and everybody laughed. And I still don't know to this day why they were laughing. I found it so odd. It's like, he's made something, and I can see it on the telly every weekend. I mean, he'd probably tell me, "Oh, it wasn't just me, and it was it was a team or whatever, and this, that, and the other." He'd probably correct me on that, and rightly so. But I've still felt really proud of that. I'm an academic now, which is not conventionally classed as a very working class thing, but I tentatively would call myself an academic from a working class background. My dad's a steel worker, my granddad was a coal miner. I grew up in Barnsley. I'm really proud of those roots and that heritage, and try and still bring that to what I do today as an academic in Sheffield, which is only about 15 miles down the road from Barnsley, but again, a very different place in a lot of senses too. So yeah, really trying to marry up that sort of heritage with the work I do now as a lecturer and as a researcher. I think the problem with those kind of identities is when that industry falls away, whether that's completely in terms of coal mining or to some extent in terms of steel, the place sort of loses a bit of its identity, So we could still call in things, Steel something or whatever, or Steel City, but then it's like, but what are we now? Do you know what I mean? Like, where are we now? And are we always going to be looking back, even though that's obviously important? Are we going to look forward to what Sheffield could become? So, thinking about Barnsley specifically, I think in some cases it has changed, but in others it hasn't. I think one thing that's always stuck with me, so, when Margaret Thatcher passed away, I always forget the exact year, but it was sometime in the 2010s. I said earlier on about how whenever Barnsley or Sheffield's in national news, it's always for a bad reason. And Goldthorpe, which is literally 2 miles away from where I grew up in Fernskoe, they had like an alternative funeral for Margaret Thatcher, which annoyed and upset a lot of people because they burnt an effigy of her as if it was like Guy Fawkes night, bonfire night. But what was really interesting is, a lot of film crews like, ITV and your BBC and that went in and asked people, why is there such a strength of feeling here? And one of the people in one of the working men's clubs over there was saying, she was like, Goldthorpe's in a time warp, It just hasn't changed in 30 years. There's been no money here. There's been, no regeneration. All you've got now is like more boarded up houses and fewer shops. I think there has been a little bit of change over the last few years. You had the big local projects, so quite a bit of money going into places like Fernskoe and Goldthorpe. You've had big regenerations in the city centre of Sheffield and the town centre of Barnsley. A lot of people go to, who I know who've never been to Barnsley, but go to Barnsley like, oh, I thought it'd be all, sad and and there wouldn't be much there, but we've got you've got this massive cinema and you've got all these lovely restaurants and stuff, and and it's nice to see that to an extent. I think that's the beginning of something, not the end of something, but I do think it's helped restore a bit of pride in places like Barnsley and again in Sheffield. I think the annoying thing, particularly again when if you're based in Barnsley or Sheffield, you're not at the forefront of the government's eye, Like, we get that we're not a massive priority. We get that. But I think just a bit of meaningful consultation would be really useful and would go a long way. But I do feel that, again, this is where I think it's really important for politicians and decision makers to really, again, take on board what people in communities are saying, because when you don't, somebody else can come in who's saying the things that people may not necessarily want to hear but may resonate with them, are giving them a scapegoat for why things are bad in their community, which can be quite enticing, unfortunately, to people who are, looking for answers to why, they're so often ignored.
So when I heard about the project, I was excited because I'm very much aware, because of my background, being an African woman, living in the diaspora, where I'm part of a minoritized group, that stories of our experiences as African people, as African women, as people from the global south, don't always get to occupy different spaces, either academia or cultural sector or anywhere really. So if there's an opportunity to get my story heard, to add to those voices, I take it up. And I thought that this is one where it's very easy for those voices to not be there, because it's about Sheffield and the past and that sort of thing. So it's very easy to not have those other voices sometimes. So I'm quite happy that you are making it very diverse. So I've had a very interesting life since I came to Sheffield. My first job was in a factory in a place called Swallow Nest. I worked in the kitchen there. So some of the very first friends I made were people that work in a factory that makes brakes and clutches for cars. So my first introduction to what Sheffield is about was from people from that working background, working in factories, working with families that worked in the mines or in the steel industry and that sort of thing. But I then moved on to working at a college where it's a very diverse group of people, and I made friends from different classes, as it were, of the British system, which I wasn't aware of. So in a college, you get people that are middle class, you get people from working class backgrounds, you get people from migrant backgrounds, and that sort of thing. So, and then later on, the work that I do now means that I work a lot in underrepresented and communities that are minoritized. So I have a huge diversity of community and connections in Sheffield, and I've made friends and working connections as well in those different communities. People are not happy that people are here and things are changing, and sometimes the stories can be negative around that, around who are you, things were good before, and now things have changed. But on a more positive note, I hear a lot of stories about people from Africa, black people, people from the global south that came sometimes in waves that were invited from other countries to come and work in different industries. Black people from the Caribbean, black people from Ethiopia and Somali Somalia and places like that. And you'll hear people say, oh, I used to work in this foundry and I worked with a man from this place in Africa. And I was saying it always makes me laugh because people always say that, but Africa is so It's so vast, and I love to hear these stories. And I was saying, for me, that's positive because it tells me that people from my own background, African people have been here and have worked here and helped in shaping this this history, this place that is called Sheffield. There have been black people working alongside Sheffielders and British people to build communities here in Sheffield and to build whatever heritage, create whatever we can call Sheffield heritage is created by people from all over the world. And so I work on projects that in Leeds, for example, with women, refugees and asylum seekers, learning English through drama. I know on a scale, that's just like, because I don't know if anybody has ever gone on to become somebody big because they've interacted with me, but I would like to believe that if I spend my time doing that, some good might come out of that. And in my actual job, I work for Voluntary Action Sheffield, New Beginnings Project. I work with refugees and asylum seekers, again, getting them involved in different activities in the city to integrate within their communities and for well-being and to develop skills that would make it easier to integrate. And I just generally think that if I work in a job, because I still need a job, in a job where I think I'm doing something towards integration, towards getting people to understand each other better and not to always have the default of blaming each other when things go wrong, then yeah, then that's what I want to do. I'm sure you'll have heard already. People in Sheffield joke that Sheffield is a village. That's because everybody meets at all these different kinds of events. So I think culture is one way of just getting into each other's culture, having empathy for each other, understanding what we are about, without trying to sit across a room and saying, "Oh, this is why, and this is better than that," and that. The talking sometimes is what creates that sense of there are some people that know how to talk eloquently about something, and there are others that don't know or don't have the language, and then they then become sidelined because they don't have the language to talk about, I don't know, to raise their hand in an Extinction Rebellion meeting, for example, or whatever. Doesn't mean that they don't understand, the issues that are urgent or that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think, yeah, arts and culture and poetry and writing brings in so many different voices into the discourse of current big issues, really.
So my father came to work in the steel industry back then, as did a lot of immigrants really back then. My father worked in the steel industry, as did my older brother. And then, obviously, as you say, the steel industry sort of started closing down. So there was more and more unemployment. We moved to Rotherham when I was a small child. I remember going to school there and sort of unemployment being around, a lot of unemployment. I remember in the 80s when it was the miners' strike and all of that, and the effect that had on the whole school, all of the children. It affected those that were miners' children and those that weren't. But just generally that, on top of the unemployment that came with the closure of the steel industry, really was... I'm saying that, as a child I hadn't, there was poverty. Poverty was poverty, and I think it's only when I look back now as an adult I realise that how much poverty there was. But it was almost, poverty was sort of normalised then, and because there was the sense that we were all in the same boat, there wasn't that differentiation, which perhaps, I suppose, you see a bit more now, really. But yeah, it did really very much affect families, and the poverty was quite stark. I remember being on free school meals as a child. But again, that wasn't odd, it wasn't unusual. So you didn't feel sort of stigmatised for that, because that was unfortunately the norm. I've worked quite a lot in health inequalities for the city. So with that perspective, I can see that the poverty, decline of the industry, the unemployment, the massive unemployment, the effect that had on people, particularly the sort of what we call global majority, what we used to call ethnic minority communities, the different cultural communities within South Yorkshire, the health consequences of our parents, fathers, particularly working in the steel industry, the effect on their ears, their lungs, all of that kind of thing. There's a lot I could say also about racism, you know, that was sort of a thread going through my whole sort of life really, and health inequalities that have come off the back of that. I believe they weren't sort of supported within the sort of industries that they worked in. They weren't sort of supported to have pensions and to think about these are the things, they didn't have unions and things like that. So I think the divide became even greater, and the knock-on consequences of that only happened when they got older. I think there was literally deaths. People died earlier because of the health inequalities and because of poverty and because of lack of pensions and all of that really. So they came to do a job and that had enormous effects on them really. But not just the immigrants, obviously, it affected a lot of people in Sheffield. The positives, I'd say, is a sense of camaraderie. You know, they say Sheffield is made up of many villages and people support each other. I've seen that throughout my life as well, you know, to sort of highlight the positives really. There's a really sense of community. I remember going back again to as a child, of the miners' strikes, and I remember collecting food, you know, like we do now for food banks. There was food being collected to be given to the families that weren't working, the fathers were on strike really, that had nothing. But that sense of community spirit was really, really strong, and I remember that well. So from all of that kind of perspective, rather than my own personal sort of day-to-day perspective, its communities have changed, immigration has changed, the migrants that have come to the city has changed. You know, over the years, you know, it's no secret there's been like different communities have come to live in Sheffield. I think at the moment there's quite a lot of, you know, I've worked quite well with the Sudanese community that are fleeing war in the Sudan and coming to live in Sheffield, and they are literally traumatised and in their homes and sort of almost scared to come out of their homes. From, you know, the information that I gathered by talking to the leaders that are trying to support them, charity leaders. So there's a lot of that going on. Obviously, you know, I have to mention the sort of the race riots and things that have happened more recently, and certainly since Brexit as well. That's something that I've personally seen myself and personally been affected by, the rise in racism, unfortunately, since Brexit. I've lived here for quite a number of years, and this is me talking from my own personal point of view, I'd never really, there was underlying racism and I'd sort of seen it around, but personally I'd not had a racist attack, a racist incident specifically, but post-Brexit that's happened on 4 separate occasions for what we would call hate crimes. I would encourage anybody to report a hate crime, and that has happened to me. One was in the city centre last year, just about 100 metres from the door of my office, unfortunately. So I do feel there is, and that's just my personal story, that one, but within communities, you know, when that happened to me, I was just thinking, my word. And I have a lot of support and friends and wonderful work colleagues around me that were 100% supportive, and I feel incredibly lucky and fortunate that I've got that. But my thoughts immediately went to people that do not have that. And, you know, I always give an example of if it was a Somali mum wearing a hijab with a couple of kids getting on a bus, what her experience must be. And I don't think that's anything unique to Sheffield, I'd just like to add. But it is there, and I think that has changed, unfortunately. That is something that has escalated, and I've seen that firsthand myself, really, which is a shame. Yeah, we're very, very fortunate here in Sheffield to have Utopia Theatre, for example, you know, and I've been part of a couple of things that Utopia Theatre have done. I feel very, very fortunate to have had that opportunity. But they do some incredible things, and and it's quite simply storytelling. And you know, they do like African drumming workshops and dancing, and anybody is very welcome to that beautiful space that they've created. But Death of the King's Horseman was on the Crucible stage in February for about 10 days, and that was a whole story based in Nigeria, and the research and what went on behind the scenes to put that play on, the fabric and the way it was made, it was so authentic. And I remember sitting there, and I just with a huge smile on my face, sitting at the Crucible. And it doesn't get more Sheffield than sitting in the Crucible with this Nigerian story being told in front of me that I had very little knowledge of, I'll be honest. That leads to social change.
How do we relate to the steel industry? Well, I guess, to start with, both my parents worked in steel. My dad at the hard and harsh and dangerous end of steel making as an overhead crane driver, and I think they called them bogeymen, who went up to the furnaces with the calipers to lift the white hot ingot out of the furnace and put onto a trolley to take over to the fellas on the rolling mills. My dad often talked about how dangerous the work was, and how he had to dumb down his Jamaicanness, you know, couldn't be seen as to be too outlandish in that environment, because that wouldn't have gone down well, how he couldn't be a trade union worker, etc. But still felt a part of that, because that was his life, working in the steelworks. And at the same time, early on, in the early to mid-60s, my mum worked as a tool buffer, you know, buffing up surgical instruments, scissors, etc. But then she got into nursing. Being part of the steel industry was kind of like, it was part of your DNA in Sheffield. It was part of your whole fabric of your being. You know, my dad worked at a place called Jessup Savills, and we actually went to sleep with the. It was a sound rather than a noise, but it was a noise, but it became a sound, a rhythmic sound of the drop stamp dropping on the metal. And sometimes you could hear the whoosh from the furnaces when sparks flew. But that became part of our DNA. It was part of what we were, what I thought was what all of Sheffield was about. You know, there didn't seem to be anything else happening in Sheffield as a child other than things related to steel. I mean, it affected me initially because, you know, when Thatcher came in, 1979, 80, I was 19, 20 years old then. So, you know, at that age, you're like Highlander. You don't see an end to anything. You know, you don't see an end to running fast or just living forever. Yeah. So, for me at that time, personally, it didn't affect me. But when my dad got made redundant in the mid-1980s, he would have been almost 40. I just saw his life drain away in him. And although he always gave a front, you know, to people on the street, or when his friends came to the house, when he was in the house, I could see that he just didn't feel like he was a whole man. You know, he was a whole man. He was still this, you know, this mighty figure, my father. But I saw like his whole being kind of drain away. He never got another job until he died at 75, like over 30 years without a job. You had a sense of pride that wherever you went, people talked about Sheffield Steel. Everybody wanted Sheffield Steel and Sheffield Cutlery, and that's my hometown, you know. But yeah. And I think because Sheffield is, you know, the 5th largest city by population, in the country, it was difficult here for a while, but not as bad as what it was with our neighbour in Rotherham, and then the mines, the coal mines in Doncaster, you know, because I worked in those places during my probation career from the early 90s through to 2016. So certainly through the 90s, I saw the devastation that was happening there as well. You know, the unemployment, the impact of drugs, you know, hardcore drugs, but probably the worst drug, alcohol, you know, the way that that was having an impact on communities who were maybe just trying to forget, you know, that this is the way of life now. So it wasn't just Sheffield, because Sheffield's like, it's like the capital of South Yorkshire. You know, it's the biggest town, it's the biggest city in South Yorkshire. So of course, you know, people came from Rotherham, from Doncaster, from Barnsley to work in Sheffield. That went, and then there was that knock-on effect. But in those times, yeah, that was the overall feeling. And, you know, and I remember feeling that, you know, the way that the landscape had to change to accommodate these very large spaces not being used anymore for their original purpose. And also, in some ways, you know, being the chair of Sedaka, I remember when we got this building in 1985, I mean, this was physically a dark place, you know, because of the smoke and the pollution coming from the steelworks. You know, the walls were blackened. But like 1985, 4 or 5 years into the industrialisation, you know, steelworks disappearing, pubs not being frequented anymore. And this little stretch here from Wicker Archers up to Ladies Bridge, I think there were about 12 public houses and went down to one, Big Gun, which is no longer there now. But yeah, that's the impact. We're getting comfortable in our own clothes again here, and you know, we're telling our own stories. So I noticed when I became chair here that there was, if you dig, there was some significant recordings of life and community from our communities. You know, in Leeds, we were recording this years ago, Manchester, Birmingham, Nottingham, London, obviously, Bristol. But we weren't doing it here. And I just had this idea that it's time that we started to record our journey to and through this city, you know, so for our parents' generation. And that's how the Bantu Archive was born, if you like. You know, I just think it's so interesting that, you know, related to one of the earlier questions, you know, how did my mum and dad come here? Two very different stories. For others, there are other, you know, various stories, you know, in some of the archive interviews we've done, you know, some people's first memories at the bus station, these double-decker buses in the bus station, that's the first memory. The pensioners now, they turn 18, that's the first memory going back all this time, you know. So I just think it's, instead of us complaining that this is not done, we don't have this story here, we don't have that record there, okay, that's the way it is. Stop complaining, create your own. And so we've created our own, and it's ongoing. And I don't know how it happened in the other cities, but that's what we've done here. So that now becomes a part of Sheffield's story. It's not just the African Caribbean story or the Windrush stories. It becomes part of the Sheffield story, it becomes part of the region, and eventually it becomes part of the national story. Because that won't happen if we don't do it. And so, how are we different? I think the main thing is that we realise that we have a story to tell from all the varied and diverse backgrounds of Sheffield. And I'm not talking about, you know, or people who just look like me, just all the Sheffield's people, you know. We don't need to be looking outside. So, yeah, I'm glad we've kind of done that. Yeah, it feels a bit more comfortable here now.
Originally, I'm from Poland, and I have been in Sheffield for nearly 20 years. It was not my choice, it just, you know, happened, but I can say it's my home city and my home, and by choice now. Because after so many years, I had the choice to move somewhere else, to bigger or smaller places, but my decision was to stay here. I have a lot of connection with local organizations and with council as well, local council. So for me, I have here my non-blood family and also connections with several community organizations. So as an employability advisor, I work with the most vulnerable group of women in Sheffield, and they are Roma women. So within the community, women usually, many women, they don't work, they stay at home. And then when the young girls, they finish their compulsory education, very often they don't continue education or they drop education in order to have family, to start the family. So we try to empower them, inspire them, to take them to universities for a trip, for a visit, to enter colleges, to invite professionals, for the Carriera event, as we will have one very soon, to support them and explain them that even for the entry level jobs, they are wanted and they want them to be part of this sector. For the Roma women I work with, for example, it's very often I come across stereotyping them that they wear long skirts or that they maybe they're not educated or they're not they live on benefits. So it's a lot of barriers which we try to break and remove for them to access education, to access volunteering, to access other opportunities as a paid employment, and to become an active member of the community. So this is what we try to do, and I think this comes from their experience and previous experience wherever they go, how people sometimes look at them, that they feel maybe we should not be there. They don't feel included in many events. So that's why what we do, we take them to those events. For example, today I have received invitation for IFAR from Pakistani community to invite 15 members of Roma community for this Sunday to celebrate together. So I think it is breaking a stereotype how those people are, because not always we have opportunity to talk to each other and to find out that actually we have the same problems, even if we come from other backgrounds, and it's more what is connecting us than what is dividing us. Wearing so many hats in Sheffield, if I can say this way. I'm a cultural champion as well for Welcoming Culture UK. So what I do, as a part of our project, I go to schools to talk about the culture, what this means for me. Very often I'm wearing my traditional clothes as well to actually prove that is nothing to be ashamed, that my background is something else than others, and all of us, we have rich culture and we should be proud of it. It may be, we can talk about food, about music, we can maybe show on the map where our grandparents come from. So with young people, I think they're getting more confident, they build their self-esteem, self-confidence and self-competence because of that. And we participate with many events in Sheffield or outside of Sheffield, especially to represent all those cultures and to come together and celebrate. We run a Sheffield Community Art Group, which is mainly to deliver during school half-term workshops for the children, especially in the areas where there are more vulnerable families and on lower income. And this area will be also around Tinsley Viaduct and area where I started, and because I know this area very well. So what I do, I support recycling shops and I buy products from them. I purchase products from them, which I then reuse to create recycle art. Yes, so as I mentioned my story about how I came here, how I arrived to the UK, and my first place where I landed was close to the area which was like related previously to steel industry. So because those two cooling generators were demolished by the owner, which is E.ON, and actually I always want to return to the area where I started because I know families there and create this art, deliver the sessions for children. And what's happened, actually the funding which I received, it was from E.ON to deliver the session. So I have realized this after so many years that actually this is what I wanted, was my dream. It's happened, and it's like a cycle, you know, it's linked from, I came from that point and I return to that point and I'm doing what I want to do. I make people happy by art, but also by recycling, by looking at environment and by the link with this whole industry. The message is very strong, especially don't forget where you come from, and you can still support your community. But whatever you do, with the long history, sometimes you are not aware, so it's very important where you move to a new place to find out what is the story behind of that place. Because the story, it can link you to something creative and successful.